Part of the reason that we kept these sealed were for the following reasons. You will see in the autopsy report of Shan'ann Watts that forensic toxicology testing indicated that in spleen blood there was a blood alcohol level of 0.128. I want to be abundantly and very, very clear about this. This does not mean that she consumed alcohol, nor that she was intoxicated. We have consulted with the Weld County Coroner's Office. We have conducted with the forensic experts at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. To a person, they have all indicated to us that that blood alcohol level is very, very consistent with normal human decomposition based upon the location and the manner that Shan'ann and Nico's bodies were buried. Secondly, you will see in the autopsy reports of Bella and Celeste a number of different substances, I think is probably the way, Mr. Blesh, that I want to address those. We have had those examined by both expert chemists as well as the coroner's office because we wanted to make sure that all of those substances could be attributed to the crude oil and the water that their bodies were found in and nothing more. The forensic experts confirmed for us that all of the substances found in those toxicology reports are consistent with being submerged in unrefined crude oil.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is the second episode in the two-parter dealing with Shan'anns Blood Alcohol Levels. The first episode stated something that was simply a fact, which is that Shan'anns blood alcohol levels were the reason the autopsy reports were kept secret, according to the district attorney. I then posed a question, which was, were Shan'ann's post-mortem alcohol levels abnormally high? And what I really wanted to do is take you guys through the thought process. And it's kind of quite a complicated thought process. It's not only your thought process as the public and as sort of the sort of average response to this scenario. It's also what is the thought process of the district attorney's office, the prosecutor, in terms of taking a case to trial. Also, what is the point of view potentially of the defense, given that you've got a plea deal that's sort of potentially hanging in the balance. And bear in mind, at any point before November 19, Chris Watts could have said, I've changed my mind, I'm not going to go ahead with this plea deal. So it was important that the prosecution didn't take any chances, right? And that may actually settle the question once and for all anyway, to say, why were the autopsy results not released? Question, answer, well, to make sure that the plea deal held on the sentencing day and that everything was, all the legal things would sort of fall into place. And one could argue that this was the plan and that the plan succeeded and that basically everyone was happy with it. So if that's the sort of size of your frame, then maybe you could say, well, there's nothing here, let's move along. There's nothing really of interest here. And in a way, True Crime Rocket Science sort of confirmed that, just in terms of the merits of the thing. And what I mean is, I then contacted a friend, a guy called Thomas Mollett, who's a expert in forensic science. I mean, this guy studied this. I actually encountered him the last time we sort of met was in Cape Town. In the courtroom, I was covering the Jason Roeder case. He was assisting the prosecutor in a way. I guess I was as well, and but less in an official capacity. But he certainly was sitting there and assisting and giving advice and all that kind of thing. And the Jason Roeder case, just give me a moment to get into this. It'll be clear why it's relevant. The Jason Roeder case was a case where you had a multimillionaire who murdered his wife in a hotel room at a sort of a big corporate event at a hotel. Now his mistress was at the same hotel at the same time. His wife had sort of come along because she suspected something was going on. She was in the same hotel room as him. He then left the hotel room to go to a party where his mistress was. His wife followed him. They eventually had a big argument. He then murdered his wife, but then he told everyone that she'd committed suicide. He had told her he really wants a divorce now, and then she had sort of gone into the bathroom and hung herself, and that was his story. The aspect that was really interesting in the Roeder case was you had the scenario of him strangling and or smothering his wife on the bed versus her hanging herself on the back of the bathroom door using a hair iron cable, right? And I learned something in this case. I was sort of aware of it, but it really became explicit in this case, which is there's a difference between the injury you will sustain if you're strangled by hand. So with manual strangulation, not necessarily smothering though. With manual strangulation, the hands are over the throat. The person underneath the hands is moving violently and aggressively, trying to survive, fighting for their life. And what happens is the hyoid bone, which floats in the neck area, can't move because the hands are quite a large surface and they are pushing downwards on the throat, preventing it from moving. And so what happens is, typically in manual strangulation, you get very idiosyncratic injuries to the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is almost like that chicken wishbone, where you know that bone where you pull it and then you make a wish. That particular bone, it's kind of not exactly a bone. It's more like cartilage, so it bends, and it's actually a very hard bone to break, and it rests in the throat. And so when the hands are over it, what happens is damage is done to that cartilage, damage is done to the hyoid bone. Again, it's not necessarily breaking the bone. It may be a fracture or bruising the bone or bruising the tissues around the bone. And so this became very explicit in the Roeder trial. And you had 4 pathologists in total, 2 from the state side and 2 from the defense, and both of these guys, both teams, I guess, were arguing against this issue of the hyoid bone. But it really became really clear to me just how what a difference, how clearly you can see whether someone is manually strangled or whether there's been something else. And so how it works is when there's a ligature strangulation, that means some kind of something like a belt or a tie or a rope or a wire cord or something like that. If that is around the neck of the victim, it rides very high up against just below the jaw, and so it sort of slips over the hyoid bone and it doesn't cause any damage to the hyoid bone. So in a ligature strangulation, you wouldn't expect any damage to the hyoid bone. In manual strangulation with hands, you would. Does that make sense? And so it's within this scenario that I got to know not just the Watts, the Roeder case, but I took that information into the Rebecca Zahau case, which is a similar situation of murder and suicide. But what was really interesting was, I discussed a lot of other things with Thomas Mollett, who was the forensic scientist involved in the Roeder case, and so I approached him when it came to this issue of the blood alcohol levels, because to be honest, I'd never come across blood alcohol levels in this kind of situation. I was aware of a lot of things around post-mortem and cadaver traces and all that kind of thing. I think the closest I'd come to something similar was in the Scott Peterson case, where those bodies were sort of out to sea or submerged for around about 3 months. But in that case, there was no question of blood alcohol, because the seawater would have diluted it and washed it away and just removed all that kind of evidence. And so this is quite a unique situation. The situation, if we're being honest, if you're going to not jump the gun and say, no, Shan'ann absolutely didn't drink anything. The question is, what do we make of these blood alcohol levels? And if you a good student of true crime, you ask a question like that and you find the answer. You don't sort of emotionally respond and say, no, I don't think there's any evidence. You say, well, what is the evidence? What does the science show? And you have faith that the science is going to give you your answer. So you don't know what the answer is, but you go and have it checked and tested. So that is what I did with Thomas Mollett. And so I approached him around about 23rd November, so very shortly after the autopsy reports were revealed, very shortly after this came out in the media. And I then asked him to investigate this. He was busy on other things, so it sort of took longer than I wanted. I was hoping he could have come back within a day or two, and it ended up being around about a month. But I wasn't paying him for this, and it ended up being quite complicated. But the question was, are these blood alcohol levels normal? And the interesting answer, and this is just the very brief answer, the interesting answer to the question, was Shan'ann's post-mortem alcohol level abnormally high? And the answer is actually yes and no. The shorter answer is no, in the sense that it wasn't abnormal. It was what you would expect given the circumstances. But the answer was also yes, they were abnormally high, in the sense that bodies in murder cases, where there are autopsies as well, typically don't have very high blood alcohol levels. The bodies are retrieved relatively soon after death. They are placed in the morgue, refrigerated, and that whole process of decomposition is then stalled, right? So the blood alcohol content in terms of Shan'ann was actually unusual. And there's a simple reason for it. It took quite a long time to find her remains, and then it took quite long to actually perform the autopsy. And if you go into Thomas Mollett's report, he provides the exact timescales. I think it was 67 hours before a body was exhumed, and then I think it was also quite a long time before the autopsy was actually performed. And so he provides a little bit of a calculation in his report where he refers to time of autopsy 10:30 on the 17th of August, and then time of autopsy after death 101 hours. That's quite a long time. Time of autopsy after recovery of body 34 hours. So that is really the key to why this happened, is the length of time. That's the one aspect. The other aspect is the ambient situation, which is the fact that it was August, mid-August in Colorado. She was in a shallow grave. One of the questions I had to him is, would the 6 inches or 8 inches that Shan'ann was buried under, would that have materially affected the decomposition? I mean, wouldn't it, not being on the surface of the ground, wouldn't there be an element of not preservation, but the prevention of the body really being heated up by the sun and all that kind of thing? And I think the answer to that was no. I think the answer is that the heat did play a factor, and because the body wasn't buried very deep and it was fairly loose sand, there was a lot of heat adding to that aspect. And so it was Mollett's conclusion that Shan'ann hadn't ingested any alcohol prior to death. I'm going to read his conclusion. He said, given the history of the unlikely digestion of alcohol prior to death, the 67 hours the body was exposed to temperate conditions, plus to a less extent the 36 hours after discovery till autopsy, and the evidence of bloating at autopsy, which suggests microbial presence and activity, it is not only possible but highly likely that fermentation and thus post-mortem synthesis of alcohol could have taken place. There is no reason to exclude this possibility. A level of 0.128 is a high BAC level, but the conditions would have been extremely suitable for the post-mortem synthesis of ethanol. Based on the reason explained in this report, it can be stated with a high degree of confidence that the 0.128 BAC was the result of post-mortem synthesis in the body. Mollet then goes on to refer to the lupus and fibromyalgia. He also refers to the fact that Shan'ann was pregnant. We don't know what the impact was of, for example, the Thrive chemicals, and also the potential of the Oxycodone chemicals in her system. We know she was also taking other medication. We don't know what the exact pharmacodynamics of that may have been. One could also even look at the last food that she ate. So while one can be very simplistic and reductionist and just say yes or no, did the alcohol come from drinking alcohol or not? And the answer is not, but that side of the story then becomes quite complicated to say what exactly caused this natural build-up of alcohol, and it's quite a lot of things, right? And so it was important to go down that road simply for True Crime Rocket Science to understand it, and also to, I won't say second guess the DA, but just to provide an independent analysis. We're now going to deal with another aspect, which is something that you guys have kind of answered, which is putting the video up yesterday. People were very quick to say, but this is really, really simple. Shan'ann didn't drink any alcohol, and it was just as a result of simple natural processes. But if that's the case, if it was so simple, why couldn't the DA just have said that in the beginning? Why all the cloak and dagger? And you might say that's taking it too far, but I've got a feeling that there's a bit more to it than that. And I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think of this. So if we agree and we say, okay, the blood alcohol wasn't an issue, then you've also got to say why be so secretive about it? If it was such an easy thing to figure out. Why be so kind of secretive about it? And we're going to do that just after I've asked you to subscribe to this channel. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell, like and leave a comment, and let's get started with that. So quite a number of you, in your efforts to try to argue this issue about the blood alcohol, I don't know whether these people have read the books and this is why they know about this, or whether they haven't read the books and they are trying to sort of convince me of something I already know. But a couple of you referred me to the Atlanta Injury Law blog. I mean, I covered this months ago, and it's a really interesting parallel case where for insurance purposes you had a life insurer not wanting to pay out because of a clause saying, if the insured was intoxicated at the time of death, then they wouldn't pay out. And so there was a drowning on a fishing trip, and when they performed the autopsy, it was I think around about 0.2%. Shan'ann's was 0.128, so this was even more, and it was around about 2.5 times the legal limit of 0.8, and this was in Georgia. And so the guy did the same thing. He went and spoke to the widow. He spoke to the guy's fishing partner. Both of them swore that the guy didn't touch any alcohol. And then the next sort of thing was that this investigator assumed that maybe there was some kind of conspiracy. Maybe the blood alcohol levels were tampered with, and so he went to the county coroner, and he was aware that it was actually on this guy's property, on the coroner's property, that the drowning occurred. And so it seems like just there was this perception of some kind of conspiracy or some kind of crookery going on. And so he then the investigator contacted an independent pathologist, which is exactly what I did. I also wanted to find out independently, why are these results the way they are? Is there any other explanation? And this investigator learned, just as I did, that the fermentation, just ordinary fermentation, could have produced this blood alcohol score. Now, try to think of it just in a normal way. You have a dead body that's got no alcohol in it because the person didn't drink any alcohol, right? And within a really short time, basically 2 or 3 days, that person's body, their remains, have suddenly accumulated the equivalent of, well over the legal driving limit, and it takes quite a few drinks to get there. And then to say, can this happen naturally? And the reality is, sometimes it can. If a crime like this happens in winter, it's very unlikely. So you need a couple of things to be in place. You need quite a lot of heat. You also need, in a way, a protective barrier for the heat. In other words, the heat needs to be able to build up and not dissipate. In this case, the body was in, I think, relatively warm water. So it was in Georgia, in maybe in shallow water, we don't know, but then maybe it was sort of washed up to the side of the bank. But it was on a hot day in August, and then he was also laid out in the sun, and then transported in a hearse in uncertain temperatures, but on a drive that took several hours. Probably the same thing happened in the case of the Watts family. They were also driven back quite a long distance. We don't know whether the hearse was refrigerated or what the situation was there. But in any event, it was important just to see how these processes worked. And in this particular case, they found it was enough time for fermentation to occur, and with that knowledge, this investigator won and the widow was paid out. And so 23 minutes into episode 2 of this particular question, we can sort of say, okay, so that's not an issue here, right? So the whole was Shan'ann drinking thing is not it's not a valid issue, right? Again, I just want to emphasize what you guys were saying is just that it wasn't very clear, wasn't very clear that it wasn't an issue, and I agree. I agree that you didn't really need this. You didn't need the autopsy report suppressed and create all that drama. You didn't need the Greeley Tribune and a bunch of other media suing the DA for access to these autopsy reports. They could simply have said, well, we have spoken to all the witnesses and it's due to natural fermentation, and released them. And I have a hunch, and I could be wrong, because I think one could certainly explain the trepidation of the District Attorney's Office was that if Chris Watts knew about his blood alcohol levels, would he have reconsidered the plea deal? And the interesting thing is, he should know about that now. I mean, it's now a year later. He knows about it now, and he hasn't mentioned anything about it. What he has mentioned is the Oxycodone. So if the district attorney were worried, I don't think they had any need to be worried. Do you? I mean, it's a hypothetical, but what do you think about it? And that then brings us to, if we look at and we listen to Rourke's words themselves, and I refer to the audio I played right in the beginning of this clip. You hear the press conference, and it's at around about 3 minutes 40, really early in the press conference, before a single reporter has spoken to him, that the district attorney starts talking about the autopsy results. That's the first thing he starts talking about, and he volunteers this information, and he's very clear. He says, I want to be very, very clear about this, and then he talks about the Shan'ann aspect, right? And then it's cleared up. And so my question is, just in terms of that, would it have been so hard to release the autopsy results, have a press conference, and just say exactly what he said there? Everyone would have been absolutely clear that there is no dispute and that the science holds up, right? I mean, it was all cleared up within really just 1 or 2 sentences, and the media didn't really even say much about it. They accepted it and moved on, and they asked questions about other things. But the really interesting part, and this is the part that I really want to talk about, but it's necessary to go through the whole blood alcohol narrative in order to get to this point, is there's another dimension to the autopsies as well. And if anything, it's more murky, and it's more fraught, and it's more sinister, I think. And what it is it's the other side, which is the autopsy results, specifically the toxicology results of the children. Now, I've told you guys that I don't believe the children were strangled. I don't believe they were smothered. There was no fibers in their lungs. Even their lungs, in a normal smothering case, which is what happened with Susan Roeder, the lungs you have petechial hemorrhages in the lungs. You have a lot of petechial hemorrhages associated with being strangled, with being smothered, and the lungs sort of little capillaries in the lungs burst as the body strains to breathe. And you didn't have that with the children. You didn't even have that with Shan'ann. There's no damage in the lungs, none of this sort of rupturing inside the lungs. And so it doesn't look like anyone in this case was strangled or smothered. I personally believe Shan'ann was attacked from behind. Something was put over her mouth, and she lost consciousness, and perhaps after losing consciousness she was strangled. I mean, there is a little bit of bruising to her throat. So that certainly seems to be the case. But even she doesn't have the kind of what's the word? She doesn't have the kind of injury one would expect from someone fighting for their life in terms of being strangled or smothered. And to be honest, my hunch was that the elevated blood alcohol was due to an ethanol rag being put over her mouth, and she breathed that in, and that sort of set the tone for the alcohol accumulations that followed. I can't prove that, it's just a hunch. But it does seem like there had to be reasons Shan'ann didn't fight back, and I don't think it's to do with cutting off her blood supply, because even if you had to cut off someone's blood supply, they would still fight back. They would still be able to what's the word, lash out and all that kind of thing. Whereas if you put something over the mouth that is toxic, it could actually have a quicker effect, and the first thing you're going to try and do is actually get this thing off your mouth. That's where your hands are going to be, and maybe that's why there were no defensive wounds. If Watts was wearing gloves, those gloves would have borne the brunt of Shan'ann's defense. So anyway, that's how I would see it. But coming back to the children, I have a strong suspicion that those crimes also, in terms of the children, were committed using chemicals, in this case oxycodone. And oxycodone would have quickly disappeared in crude oil. And this is the part that I think is the real reason why the autopsy reports were sealed. And this is where things get really, really murky, because if you follow the reasoning to its logical conclusion, I don't think if you say, no, I agree, I think the reason why the autopsy reports wasn't due to the blood alcohol, it was due to the autopsy reports of the children, then effectively what that showed was that there was no chemical substances. So it's actually helping the prosecution's case, just in the sense that there's no let me put it in another way. It's not sort of putting the narrative of really either the prosecution or the defense anywhere. I don't know if that makes sense. In other words, if you listen to what Rourke says, he talks about the substances found, and he uses that word, the substances found when they did the toxicology, and he even refers to a sort of follow-up where specialized chemists checked the substances, and basically he was just saying, we ruled out that any other substances were found, which in a way, let's say oxycodone was used, in a way it's the prosecution perhaps unknowingly, perhaps unwittingly shooting itself in the foot, because if oxycodone was used and those substances were destroyed by being explicit about the fact that these substances didn't exist, is potentially ruining that option in their case. Okay, and then from the defense perspective, if Watts had said he'd used oxycodone, but the prosecution couldn't prove that he did or didn't, it just in terms of the potential court narrative or trial narrative, that doesn't really take you anywhere, right? So I don't think there would be any reason to suppress that aspect, because it's not benefiting either side, except that it could potentially be very prejudicial in terms of Guess Who and Adako. Can you imagine if you having discussions in court about toxicology in terms of these chemicals? What kind of effect does this chemical have in damaging the human body? What about this chemical? It brings it to life in a very, very graphic way, and in terms of a high profile trial, there would be all sorts of safety issues and protocols that would be highlighted at a time that nobody wanted it, in terms of the oil majors. They were about to undertake a merger with either Occidental or Chevron. So you're going to have a lot of damaging PR potentially, which could drive the brand image and thus the brand value down just prior to a acquisition. You wouldn't really want that. And bear in mind that Anadarko basically Anadarko and the whole sort of oil and gas industry basically pay the majority of taxes for Weld County. And if you're a public prosecutor or public defender, where are your salaries actually coming from? Just in terms of the general situation in Weld County, where's most of the money from Weld County coming from? And so you have a potentially very damaging trial where you've got 2 employees from that company, that's the biggest company pretty much in the county, and they are now talking about things that violated safety protocols and toxic chemicals and all this kind of thing. And in other words, just a public relations nightmare for the oil industry and for Anadarko in particular. And who could make that public relations nightmare disappear? Well, Weld County could. And they could make it look like it was disappearing for the right reasons, meaning why take this case to trial? He's made a plea deal and he doesn't want the death penalty. Well, I think some people bought that argument, but if the death penalty was never going to be on the cards, then it's not really a valid argument. But this then also brings back the question, why would you want to suppress the autopsy documents? Why would you want to not release them? And again, I just want to emphasize the following. Yes, where we are now, a year later, they have been released, and it was like there was nothing really in them. Like if you go and look at the autopsy information, it seems very vanilla. There just doesn't seem to be anything happening there. In a weird way, they seem to have simply just taken Watts's version, and that's the version of the autopsy reports, which is to say that Shan'ann was strangled and that the children were smothered. If you take those words in the first confession, they're first used by Watts's father, Ronnie, where he says choked him, and then he says strangled, and then smothered. And so you had these 3 different words, and the kinds of injuries that you're going to get between strangling and smothering are completely different. And if you take that even further, when Watts talks about what he saw, how he saw Shan'ann strangling the children now, and this should be, if he's talking about how she strangled them, he's trying to explain more than likely what he did. What he did. Doesn't that make sense? And so in that first version, he refers to Shan'ann, he's seeing her via the baby monitor, and in other words, he's saying he can't really see what's going on. And then when Cece is strangled, he can't see what's going on either because Shan'ann's in his way. So he's never standing there and witnessing it. He's sort of not seeing it happen. And I believe he's saying that because that's not actually how the children died. It's how people expected they died, for example, his father and the agents, but that's not actually how they died. And as soon as we go into the toxicology, that's where the questions start arising. All I'm saying is, if you think about the toxicology in the same way that I've asked you guys to think about the blood alcohol, and you say, how do these processes naturally work? And you think about it, you go down that road, and you do the same with the toxicology, and you say, if oxycodone, for example, was used, would you expect it to have been in the toxicology results? And I asked Thomas Mollett this as well, and the from the research we've done, the answer is no, meaning the natural pharmacodynamics. Oxycodone is a very quickly absorbed drug in the human body. Heat helps it to absorb. You don't want to eat it with food either. It just absorbs very, very quickly. And you can imagine the inside of those oil tanks being like a giant stomach as well, with a lot of chemicals present and a lot of heat present as well. And you can imagine if oxycodone is quickly, there's a very short half-life, if it is very quickly absorbed by the human body, it would also be very, very quickly broken down in this chemical drum. And bear in mind, it wasn't just the oil around the girls' bodies in terms of the oil that soaked into their bodies. It was also a lot of oil that was flushed out of the system when the oil tanks were opened, and then that oil was taken away. So that, if there was any evidence, it was potentially lost. But I don't think any of the evidence would have survived. I don't think it could have survived, because you've got these sort of digestive chemical processes from very corrosive chemicals. And so that whole analysis, where if you're going to release the autopsy reports at the time where everyone's thinking about it, more than likely people would have thought about this then, which is this idea of destroyed evidence, and just taking things backwards and saying, if we look at the blood alcohol journey, what about the journey of X, Y, and Z? And so that's why I think the autopsy reports were sealed. If any of you disagree, if any of you are experts at chemistry, or if any of you know someone who is maybe a chemical engineer or something like that, I want to challenge you guys to take on this whole issue of if there was oxycodone in their systems, it would definitely have appeared in the toxicology. So I've undertaken this study of the fermentation. I've got hold of this expert. I want to challenge you guys to independently go and research this yourselves, or find someone who can. I've obviously written about it in Silver Fox, but again, I want you guys to, let's see how clever you guys are, and let's see what information you guys come up with. If there was oxycodone used, should it have, or could it have, or would it have come up in the toxicology after being submerged in crude oil for 4 days? Would you have expected it? Should you expect it? And then I think while you're on that journey to getting that information, you're going to be studying the safety aspects and the certain health aspects of the chemicals found in crude oil, many of which are carcinogens. And then just imagine all of that research that you're doing, all of those discussions being front and center in a media narrative at the time that Anadarko wants to be bought for a good price by Occidental. Just put those two thoughts in your mind at the same time, and then ask yourself the question: were the autopsy results really suppressed? Were they really sealed because of the blood alcohol, or was it because of the damaging PR that releasing the autopsy results could have opened, where people started talking and reporting on that aspect? You be the judge. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do like, share, ring the bell, leave a comment, and I will be back with another discussion which deals with the reenactment that Watts does during the first interrogation, where actually kind of role plays how the children were strangled. And what I'm going to do there is take this narrative just a little bit further, which is